There we go. There. You there? It's on your
Oh,
end.
yeah, I'm
Okay.
here.
Okay, great. We'll just wait for Tiffany and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
we'll get started. All right.
Sounds good. I am 10 minutes early, so I'm not surprised that she's not here yet. I just
Yeah,
wanted
no,
to test out my setup to make sure that everything was good on my end.
Yeah, no, that was a smart idea. How you doing today?
Doing good. How about you?
Uh, I'm glad it's not raining like it was yesterday,
Definitely.
since that was a tropical storm.
Yeah, yeah. I ended
So,
up batting
how are
down the
things?
hatches. Yeah,
Huh?
go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, I said I had to batten down the hatches, if you will. All the windows were closed and the wind was howling all night.
Oh God, I'm not surprised. Yeah, I had to take out the AC yesterday morning.
Mm.
I'm like, I know if I leave this in, it's gonna soak all over me. So I better take this out as soon as I wake up. And I don't even have central air. I have one of the old. Remember the units when we were growing up? You would just put them in your window.
Yes, that I don't. That's still what I have. So, but
So some
I'm
people
very
still have
familiar.
that. There are
Yeah,
parts
yeah.
of our childhood, I swear, we're still always going to be attached to from technology standpoint, like for a boom box, the AC unit you can use
Yes.
now,
Yes.
the bubble screen
I
televisions.
mean, it's
My
also
God,
construction,
huh?
but it's also construction. It's also depending on the construction of where you live, because not every place, as much as we'd like to think so, has central air like built in. Like a lot of the buildings still don't have it. So.
Oh, well, yeah, a lot of buildings in New York City are also old, so it's
Yeah,
understandable. Like
yeah, yeah.
everything I think dates back all the way to like the 1900s or something like that, right? Or at least most of the buildings.
Right, yeah, 1900s, 1950s. Yeah.
Anywhere between that time frame.
Yeah, that's right. But they always glorify it. It's like, yes, you can live in a pre-war building.
Yeah, until you look at the values of today's rents and then you realize what that person paid back in the 1900s, between the 1900s and the 1950s is so frigging inflated today, nobody can afford a house.
Yes, yes.
Although I'm not saying, my our parents didn't have their own challenges back then, but money what didn't have to be in a constant flow as it does today.
Yeah.
Hey, but technology is better. I mean, you couldn't think about this for 1 second. I was talking to one of my friends about this. If I wanted to do something like this 10 years ago, it would have been harder with the technology we had 10 years ago. But now look at how much.
And it would have taken longer because you would have had to have edited by hand and longer to get out because you'd need like the distribution.
Oh, exactly. I mean, in some things, I could say even the evolution of YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot that YouTube has been around since 2006,
Right.
2 years after I graduated high school, and then look at how much. Oh, it was Madeline who I was talking to about this. She was telling me we were having a discussion about how marketing has changed in the last 15 years. I'm like, how I studied marketing back in the 2000s is so much, you know, half of that marketing probably you can't even apply it to today.
Right.
And even social media. Look at social media when we were kids and look at social media now.
No, totally different. I mean, I was in some of those chat rooms, Mi Gente, and like the old AOL and places where you chatted, and completely different.
Oh yeah. God, it's evolved in our short lifetimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just accelerating because if you think things went fast for us, now that the internet's been around and everything, it goes even quicker now, especially with stuff like AI leading the charge and things like that. So
Yeah,
it's only going to get faster.
but government policy doesn't update.
Well, that can't keep up because even though those are in theory living documents, to make any changes, you need to meet too many requirements.
Oh yeah, no, I know. And you can't get everyone to agree.
Right. That being the biggest requirement.
I mean, because everyone has their own idea.
Yeah.
So what's your little guy doing in the background right now?
Oh, they're good question. They're around. So they were watching something on television, or I'm actually at my mother-in-law's house. We're having a little Sunday, uh, like lunch and dinner, and my brother-in-law's coming over
Oh,
after this.
nice.
So I'm not even on location, or at least not my location anyway.
No, it's fine.
Uh,
You're using somebody else's location.
I know, but it
I
works.
was gonna do this from somewhere else today, but I'm like, due to the time crunch, it's just so much easier to do it at home.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just glad I was able to find a spot and that they had Wi-Fi. As long as I can find a place,
Well,
and
that's
they
the advantage with today. As
yeah,
long as you can find anywhere with reasonably good Wi-Fi or internet.
yeah. And then luckily because we are my mother-in-laws, they can keep the kids busy elsewhere.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure it would be a challenge with you at your regular spot.
Yeah.
Let's see if this works. All right, that should hopefully do the trick. I just threw some headphones on myself, so in
Yeah.
case.
I always wonder, even with the headphones, like especially for the mic, how sensitive it is. Because I know that I hear my kids. I'm always curious whether or not the mic is picking them up.
I think it might be. Sometimes I feel like it does, depending on the type of conference that you do. And yeah, by the way, that point is right. I remember learning Adobe Premiere back in the 2000s. So the next expense that I'm going to be picking up aside from Zoom right now is going to be the Adobe Premiere license, so I can start relearning the editing things.
Oh, that's cool. I'm gonna get my son Alejandro some classes from Cinema Kids online. Apparently, they have something about sort of film editing and After Effects. So he's gonna learn that stuff. But we were waiting because we're gonna do this through self-direction and OPWDD. So once that budget is approved, then I'll move forward and kind of go.
Oh, you're going to teach him. Does he like editing? Has he taken
Yes,
classes?
he actually wants to. That's what he mentioned he wanted to do. So those are some of the classes. He's also wants to do ceramics. He's all about timelines, videos. Like I still remember, I've learned a lot from him while he was growing up because like the history of logos, companies, those types of timelines. So yeah, I mean, I've appreciated kind of like his interests.
Yeah, and it's funny. Yeah, it was Madeline. I said something to her and I kind of realized something else. And then I was talking to Justin about this. On some level, because I changed majors 3 times during college, I wonder if I should have stuck to communications, because he and I were having a conversation about a potential further degree. The whole problem is I was terrible in math. And even for something like communications or film production film degree about 10 years ago, I don't know if it's still the same today. You would have had to do an internship, and then there's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to get a job within the film industry. So I went over to business administration, marketing, and sports management, because at the very least, if I had something within my life that was deemed stable, then it would be easier to break into the media industry. And yet I'm at the same problem now, which is I almost can't get taken as anything seriously other than customer service. So it's kind of like,
there's no safety. I mean, part of the problem is there's no safety in any of these industries anymore. Like this safe approach to like moving forward doesn't exist. There is being an entrepreneur, doing what you're doing, and essentially
but I have to do it on a 9 to 5.
Right.
Just like you have to do it on a 9 to 5 yourself, working as somebody's clinical services supervisor, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
But until I can get it. And then I actually, I would probably keep the positions anyway, just because I do enjoy them. But the goal is to eventually have the entrepreneurial part take over and more than cover everything, literally.
That's exactly. I have something interesting, and then depending on when Tiffany jumps on, that I want to say, speaking of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
I should have done this when I was younger, started doing something more for myself. But I think a huge problem that we all know, especially with the entrepreneurial hat, it's the people you surround yourself with.
Yes, that is a very good point. Mm-hmm.
Because my mother would sort of seemingly encourage it, but then there's like my dad, there's still the corporate version of her that knows you still kind of need your bases covered, trying to say, oh, it's easier when you're working for somebody. Not anymore. Not anymore. Unfortunately, working for somebody doesn't always entail direct happiness either, but it's a struggle to get your own thing going now.
Right. That's why it makes sense maybe to start off with that and like save and start work your way out of it, which, people do. I mean, when I was at social work school getting my master's, I met people from Goldman Sachs who were like on their second career because they had kind of established themselves.
Funny enough, that's going to be one of my questions. I say we get started, since she's gonna probably take a few more minutes. All right?
Sure.
Okay. All right, guys. Welcome back to Pick Your Brains podcast. Today we're gonna do things a little differently. I have Francis, who is on one of my I have Francis today, who was on one of my panel discussions back in February, who's a social worker, and he will be joined by his colleague Tiffany, hopefully very shortly, who's an entrepreneur herself, but both with social work backgrounds. So today we're going to delve into a little bit of both your career stories. For you especially, I want to get to know a little bit more about what it's like being the parent of an autistic child, or somebody on the autistic, or a child on the autistic spectrum, and how rewarding that can be. And then also we're going to probably focus a little bit on, you know, on some financial advice that you could be giving people on, that we could be giving to parents on the spectrum, for for children on the spectrum, because initially our audience for this is going to be a wide range of people. It's going to be everyone from teachers to social workers to grandparents and parents. So, with all that said, let's get started with a couple questions for you. When you started out in college, and if I remember correctly, you were born in 1981, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
So that means we are in the top of Gen Y, or the millennials.
Mm-hmm.
So we're the senior end of the group, or the geriatric group, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
So in a funny way, my last two guests, we delved into a little bit of DEI and what it was like, you know, with my guest last week, Patty, who worked in corporate DEI and different things. And my guest a week before that was a former police officer in the NYPD, who's now a restaurant consultant later on in his life. We talked a little bit about city policy. We talked about his career, you know, for the brief amount of time that it was as a cop, and then what he was able to do afterwards. But for the focus of today, it's going to be autism and your experiences as a parent, and so on and so forth. So, first question: what was your very first major in college, and what college did you attend?
I was privileged enough to go to Columbia University, and the way I found my majors was kind of funny. I was sitting next to a friend of mine that I didn't know was going to the same school. It was in a math class. It was a calculus class, and he was going into engineering. And it was a Calc BC that we're talking about, rotating objects in space and the air and the volume. And I started remembering in high school, like, I'd done okay in math. I'd been able to achieve that level, but I really wasn't the person who was going to be doing that in the future. So I found out about a class with this professor. I'll never forget her, Priscilla Ferguson, Sociology for Everyday Life. And that was the class that changed my life. That became my major, sociology. And I did Latino studies as well, because I was always very interested in Latino culture and history as well. So the two became my two majors as I moved forward.
Last week, I did an interesting post speaking of sociology, because I actually enjoyed that course when, you know, from the business major's perspective. I did a post on what we call Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very positive you're familiar with that, where the base at the bottom, you know, is, if I remember correctly, there are several different needs on that hierarchy, but the most important ones seem to be food, shelter,
Correct.
and what was the other major one that needed to be satisfied before you could move up the pyramid?
Oh yeah, definitely food, shelter,
Clothing.
and
Safety.
clothing safety. Yeah. And actually that goes very much with a lot of what we would be talking about, because for me, if you think about it, money health is mental health, and health is wealth. So you need to have like that stability, like that first level, because if you're having to choose between paying your rent or mortgage, buying food,
Student loans.
those are all like very tough choices. So of course you're going to end up being chronically depressed or anxious, and getting sick, because you're going to be basically stressing out. Finance can be the root of a lot of these problems.
Of course, unfortunately, finance is a huge root of all these problems. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize today. It's actually funny, because when you talk to people, we might be the same age. Madeline is, our friend who we connected through, is also, a very good, wise person to be to be talking to. Unfortunately, she and I are in two different chapters, and even with my situation, am I grateful for what I have? Yeah, but when I'm talking to somebody who's 10 years, in a different stage of her life where some of those needs might be satisfied, it's a little more trickier for me to say, well, I make this. I'm not ungrateful for it, but things could be better.
Right. I mean, I think that what you're saying, that things could be better, is always true. I mean, as long as you have a frame of reference, there is no best. I think the first myth that has to be kind of looked at and sort of dispelled is the idea that there is such a thing as a best. You can only have like some kind of a comparison when you have, an object to compare it to. So there's only potentially better, and you need at least two things to think about to be able to make that determination.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, because unfortunately, everyone has a different definition on Maslow for what they feel they would need in this world. Some people believe it's a job that can satisfy most of those needs, and I believe in some aspect they're 50%, they're 40 to 50% right that the job is the important thing, but it isn't always, because that first wage, unfortunately, sometimes can be a barometer for what you make later on in life. So I will give a very short example, and you can tell me if in your clinical experience you had seen this.
Okay.
People on the autistic spectrum, you could look at me and say I'm definitely what's the word there's a word I'm looking for. I could be a good example to them, because notoriously most people on the autistic spectrum or lower functioning to higher functioning, not everyone makes the same wages, but a lot of autistic people are paid less than me, but I have a mediocre salary at best. It satisfies some needs, but it can't satisfy everything. So instead of comparing myself to other autistics, this is what other people do around. Do you believe as a parent that is a good idea or a bad idea?
I mean, I think it's a bad idea. I think, each person is an individual regardless. And the same thing, when you say the name, you're on a spectrum. People vary. So the best way, or a better way, I should say, of looking at it is more in terms of where you yourself have come from and where you've gotten to is actually about it's what in research they probably called a single case study, because you start with the person at one point, get a baseline, and then see where are they from there. So that's one thing. And the other problem is the idea of expectations. I think what always makes things problematic, and as you mentioned, there are things that you're grateful for, but it all depends on expectations. So, and I tell my clients to think about it this way: if your expectation is here, right, and you meet it, then you're in theory satisfied. So if you meet the expectation, you're going to be satisfied. If your expectation is here, but you only get up to maybe here on where you want to be, then you're going to be dissatisfied because it's under it. So of course, if you manage to exceed your expectations, you're going to be really excited and happy about that. But the interesting thing, though, is we have control of our expectations. So if you realize, sometimes you need to move your expectations, and sometimes you need to move your results, because
That's
one will follow the other.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because as I'm scrolling back and looking for the hierarchy, yes, air, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and reproduction are on the hierarchy. But then you get to the next level, which is personal security, employment, resources, health, property. So instead of looking at my situation or your situation based on these two levels, especially for somebody on the autism spectrum, I can say this much. In some cases where certain things might not have met my expectations, like, for example, I'll go to level 2 and say resources.
Right.
I should be making more than what I'm making. Ideally maybe like between 25 to 30 for the amount of things that I can do. But unfortunately, we have human resource departments that don't see it that way. And then they want they want to evaluate people based on a degree. When in this day and age, I'm starting to get the feeling it's not the degree so much that they want. They're not wanting to be open-minded to other ways of learning or other possibilities in a candidate, because they want to box themselves in to hiring one type of person. And everybody, can be a different type of an employee or a different type of entrepreneur. But when you have everyone doing the same thing, what do? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And I think what you may be referring to, at least in terms of a certain perspective, is as a culture, we are an ableist society. I mean, if you take a look at sort of the availability for people to, be more mobile and everything, it's only recently, because people have been sort of advocating for themselves, that they're even adding, ramps, or they're adding elevators to subway trains. And when medical decisions are going to be made, or when efforts are going to be put in, people who have different types of challenges, both physical and cognitive challenges, they opt, or even age, like the elderly, they tend to think that they'll optimize by, helping people who have other advantages and in theory have a big, brighter future, or they can get more bang for their buck.
Now, before I go to the scholar program, define for us what ableism is. I know what it means, but the audience isn't going to understand what it means.
Well, ableism has to do with sort of our perception, where we take others' abilities for granted. So in other words, we uphold this standard that we think everybody should meet, essentially. And then we
evaluating people the same way, like with what affirmative action was supposed to sort of do, but then the people who were dealing with affirmative action may not have done it the correct way.
Right. And I think the other thing that needs to be taken out, even with something like affirmative action, if you think about it, in some ways, people forget that there were sort of different similar policies, because they were like, okay, we're striking down affirmative action. Great. We're going to make everything quote unquote equal. But the problem is, the idea was to level the playing field. Before that, you could say, right. And not only that, the legacy option, which exists, that definitely is a form of, unleveling the playing field. So, and I was playing devil's advocate the other day, and I was telling somebody, you know what? If you really want to be 100% fair and, try to level it, in all honesty, what it should be is a lottery, a 100% lottery to see who gets in, because then you're not taking those characteristics into account. But do you really want to do that? I mean, you do have to take into account, people's abilities, because at some level they need to have certain skills and, to be able to succeed in different programs.
All right. So speaking of program, what was the Goldman Sachs Scholar Program?
Well, the Goldman Sachs Scholar Program was something that I did when I was in high school. So I found out about it through Prep for Prep, which is the program that got me into private school. And essentially, it just required certain grades, interviews, you can kind of imagine it. And what it consisted of was getting the opportunity to get a computer, a desktop at that time, for free, which was great, and an internship at Goldman Sachs for the summer, and you were placed in different areas. For me, it was the part that eventually became compliance. So my role that summer was to, of course, learn about Goldman Sachs, go through their program, what different people do, things like that, some basic training on all those things, and then also participate with that department, which consisted, like I said, compliance, making sure that the different investors had their Series 67 license, Series 63, all their securities license, 7, 3, that they needed to be able to do their jobs.
So investment bankers, I am assuming, needed those series licenses, or stockbrokers and stock traders needed those?
The brokers. I mean, if you're involved in sales of securities, you need the licenses, because it's a highly regulated industry.
Highly regulated industry, yeah. That makes sense, because it's funny. I had a manager at Goodwill who worked at Lehman Brothers for 30 years as a stockbroker, and he did say that he held 4 or 5 different securities licenses.
Mm-hmm.
I think he had the 6 and the 7. I know he had one of the other ones, and then I think he got a real estate license, if I remember correctly. But then again, I don't, because he was with their firm from 18 years old to about 1996. In his final year there, he said one of the reasons he left was life got too stressful for him, and this was about 1 decade before the whole firm basically collapsed.
Well, so he was lucky then, because I mean, that period. I mean, there's a great movie about sort of the bubble, the 2008 bubble, The Short.
Yeah, The Big Short.
The Big Short, yeah,
That
yeah.
was done by Adam, what's his name, who cast Christian Bale and Steve Carell, and they ended up all doing Vice.
Yes, and one important point though that I think people miss, but that I caught personally just because of my lenses, I was watching that movie. The Christian Bale character was definitely on the spectrum, and it did come
Remind
out
me
later.
who Christian Bale played.
He played the guy that said that this made no sense, the logic behind it, that the market had to collapse because it had no basis. So he held on to his guns, kept the money invested, even though it's not what the people wanted, and made them a boatload of money because he was very adamant and
So I'm going to make an interesting point to this, since you're on the topic about the spectrum and Christian Bale's character. I sensed that as well when I watched clips of the movie on YouTube and then watched the whole thing through. It's funny because to actually be in the financial sector, I swear most of those people are undiagnosed, and I could be right about that.
Definitely, but I mean, it's not unheard of. I mean, just on LinkedIn, or maybe I don't know in person, but Andrew Camaro is a great example. I mean, he had his own financial firm as well, and was doing a little good. I mean, I think he recently kind of is taking a vacation to be more with his family, and he has his podcast. So I mean, it's giving people an opportunity and letting them be able to realize themselves.
Yeah, no, I can completely see that too. So now my next question for you is, what did you do for the Department of Education since you worked for NYC DOE?
Yes, that was actually an interesting point in my life. It was recently out of school, and I ended up working as a parent coordinator, which is a title that I had at the time. But what I was actually doing at the school was more like being the principal's right hand. I would help her with all the emails to the parents, to the staff. She taught me how to write strategic emails, who you needed to copy in CC or BCC on the emails. And it was actually right around the time when I decided that I wanted to go into social work, because another part of my role was actually doing a lot of translation and work with the guidance counselor that was there. So it started moving me in that direction.
And you know what's very interesting, because when we were growing up, literally social work, and I commented on this to Madeline, I wonder if this was the path I could have chosen, but when we were growing up, you know, it was unheard of for anyone to want to go into this because you couldn't make a lot of money with it. Or what they were recruiting for, I think most people just didn't see as a reasonable career path, which was mental health counselors, therapists. You didn't really necessarily make the best salaries, especially out here in Westchester County. You're making probably less than, starting out, maybe like less than 50,000 a year or something like that, depending on the agency. But in the city, you would have to make arguably a little more. And it's funny because when I went back and read a couple of Madeline and her other colleagues' stories, and then I see what it is now, they can make better salaries and they can find other entrepreneurial opportunities now just because of the background.
Right. I mean, I think part of the problem is, like anything else, the field is and has been judged through a particular lens. I think there was a couple of challenges. One, it was feminized, so a lot of it, it's kind of like a male nurse, a male social worker. It's a little bit unheard of.
Okay, but I want to cut you off on one point, because you said male nurse.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at nursing, and I'm in the medical field myself, unfortunately, the clinical positions are where the better salaries are, because
Correct.
if I want to become an analyst or, anything related to like digital marketing, I need another degree because of the fact that a clinical work person like yourself can command a better salary, meaning I have nothing against the mental health field, you know, the mental health field or therapy field as a whole, or healthcare as a whole. But
Right.
the fact that somebody like me needs to go through more school, on debt just to make a better salary is, I'm not going to say a crapshoot. It's a little unreasonable, for somebody who just wants to step into a corporate role.
Yeah,
But
no, but
I understand
yeah,
because
no,
of
I mean,
the fact that you're clinical.
right. It's the fact that it's a way of legitimizing, and there is a hierarchy in all these things. I mean, obviously, the way that it's structured, even within the medical field, and even if you are mental health, it's still kind of like psychiatrists because they have the medical degree, psychologists because they have the doctorate, and then kind of like us, followed by like licensed mental health counselor, which is kind of a newer designation. But the point that I was trying to make before is the disparity in pay partly is because of that, even though men still technically probably do a little bit better. And then in terms of the origins of social work, it
Male
was founded
nurses.
by women who, they had these houses and they were already wealthy, so they had no need for the additional income or money. So that's why now there's a different lens and a way of looking at social work where we can do so much more because the skill set is very versatile and you can apply it to many industries. And that's where the entrepreneurial part is, the ability to like do more things and focus in on different areas.
Yeah. And that is probably why sometimes people like myself are feeling stuck. They're good fields to be in, but when you have to, now go for more education, it gets a little tricky because there are other industries that'll have a similar standard. But anyway, what I was going to say on nursing is, if you become a nurse, whether you're a man or a woman, it becomes a union position. So
That is correct.
there's at least some level of safety in being a nurse. So it's not bad for a man to consider going into that. But yes, the feminized issue on some level, I would agree with. That's what made it a little trickier.
Mm-hmm.
So the licensed master social worker exam, was that a hard exam to take?
Well, I mean, I have to speak from my experience. I mean, I know a lot of people that have testing anxiety and different challenges when it comes to testing. So they tend to have a harder time passing or even taking the exam because of those situations. So I've known plenty of people who've had to take it multiple times before passing, and it can be difficult because of what I said in terms of like their previous experience. For me, I've been blessed to always be a pretty good test taker. So both in terms of content retention and sort of test taking strategies as well. So for me, it wasn't particularly difficult in terms of preparation and
You
execution.
kind of just hit something, because test anxiety is a huge reason why I ended up with a subpar GPA. And one of the reasons that I'm a little hesitant to go back for another degree right now, partly it was also because of math, because not every autistic person is good at math.
That's true.
And math, unfortunately, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources. And then a point that I was just making to my CTO yesterday about this, if you present math to me in a way that I would see math at a bank, like on a balance sheet, I'll understand it. But if you try to teach it to me the way you teach an engineer, I'm not going to understand.
Right.
And that's a huge part of the reason why college took me so long, was because math was being presented in a way that wasn't retainable to me.
Right. Well, the thing with math is it's complicated. One, this is the generation of the new math, which I'll never understand what they're doing.
Common
And
Core.
right, exactly. Just because I've seen my son's homework and they want him to do it all these different methods when I'm like, okay, it's great to know that, but we used to get along fine without, all this extra stuff in terms of the way we learned it. And then the other aspect of it is that it's no longer straight numerical math. Like now they want to test using a lot of word problems. So now you're mixing two things on
You have
tests,
a lot of
confusing
older
people.
people at the Department of Education across the country in different states who are all making these decisions on what math they think we need. And people And honestly, with math, I think our age group should be making the decisions on what math people really need for the real world. Because
Yeah.
knowing all that math, there's not necessarily a benefit to knowing all these complex equations if they're not going to be used.
Right. Plus, the other problem is that the curriculum in general is not developmentally appropriate, because if you match up the skills that people develop going through the different ages, it doesn't match up with what they're taking, the courses and the expectations of what they have to learn.
I think she's on. Hey.
Hello, I'm so
Hey.
sorry.
No, it's fine. So now that I've gotten through about some of his questions. We'll do a few questions for you so you can join the conversation. So this is
Yeah,
Tiffany, everybody, and her and Francis both work together. So my first question for you, from a young age, what did you want to do for your career? At a young age. And the other question is, I think you were born in the United States, but where did your family originally come here from?
yeah, good question, Benjamin. Thank you for having me on your
Oh, you're
podcast, having
welcome.
us both on our podcast. Can you both hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Um, I had just gotten out of urgent care. My voice has been very much a mess over the past weekend, so um, I'm trying to get that fixed. And answering your question, what did I want to do when I was younger? How did I come to this profession? I feel like I've always wanted to be a social worker, even before I knew what social work was. And it's because I naturally had a heart of helping people, of serving, of volunteering. I grew up in the church. And so it was always about like, how can you help the community? How can you help one another? And then when I found social work, I was just like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this my whole life. I just kind of like fell into it. And it wasn't until I got to, I think one of your questions is, where did I go to school eventually?
Yeah.
It wasn't until I went to Stony Brook University that it opened up to my eyes into what social work not only was, but also everything else that it can encompass. And that was more than just a clinical aspect. It was also very political, very macro, very community oriented, very advocacy. And that's what I fell in love with, um, making more of an impact at a greater scale.
Yeah, because unfortunately you can't solve everybody's problems in clinical, and I should even know that, from working at a medical group in orthopedics, they're only effective up until a point. There's a point in the treatment where the person has to be able to fully take care of themselves, and they don't always want to do that. And then when they don't get what they're looking for out of the doctor, now they want to sue the doctor when the doctor gave you a basic idea of how to best take care of yourself,
Right.
which unfortunately I think most people are having a harder time with grasping nowadays. If you take care of yourself reasonably well, then yeah. All right, so you went to Hunter College and Stony Brook, or which one was the undergraduate degree?
Stony Brook University.
And the master's degree was Hunter, right?
Yep. So
Was the
women's school.
admission process for Hunter College a little more difficult from a grades perspective?
Um, I had applied to all of the major social work schools, and it wasn't until Hunter is the last one to get back to you, notoriously. Um, I would say theirs was definitely a little bit more difficult. They have an entire interviewing process. You have to sit with all the boards, the dean, everybody. And the other schools didn't really require any of that.
All right, so now I can now ask you two a great question, since Tiffany just hit on it with there are other aspects of social work that drew her to, which was the whole community part of it. How did you both end up in financial services?
You want to go first, Tiffany?
Yeah, I can certainly share first.
Yeah.
Benjamin, honestly, I never thought I would see myself in finance ever in my life. I actually struggle with undiagnosed, but a form of like dyslexia, in which I have a consistency in transposing numbers and everything. So I was really, when I found myself in the financial industry, I was really insecure about my ability to provide people value with my own insecurity. And I think what really stuck out to me and how I ended up in finance is because of the mission. It being that we are truly revolutionizing the financial industry in our grassroots approach in how we educate and provide accessibility to financial education to all. Our mission
I
is no family left behind. Huh?
I was going to
Yeah.
say that was probably the biggest knock, especially with traditional finance. And even when I used to look at it myself, not, you know, their information is so freaking outdated. It's like, I think the sector is stuck in the 20th century, but it should be in this century. Like, here's a good example. And let me see how you two feel about this. Okay. Last week, I have a very close friend of mine who's in the field of civil engineering. We were discussing affordable housing application. Then he was looking at my bank statement. So he basically criticized me on the fact that there were 80 cash transactions, and then wanted to start giving me on a debit card, and then he wanted to start giving me advice that you would find if you've ever followed podcasts like Dave Ramsey, who's completely outdated with his beliefs, but that's from our parents' decade. So at that point, arguably, this advice made sense. Instead of taking cash, use your credit card because you get the points and then pay the balance off at the end of the month. But here's the problem with budgeting. I don't know if you two would agree with me or not. Are people's habits more of a spending problem or more of a cash flow problem? I'm talking in accounting terms.
I can answer it's both. People aren't making enough. Employers aren't paying enough. Employers sometimes can't pay enough, and they can only pay the position. And that's not really a reflection of the person and their abilities. It's just what the employer is able to provide in that moment, maybe. And the flip side of it, I think the more money that you make, the more that you spend. I've sat with doctors, I sat with many professionals, you could say high earners that are still maybe living above their means, right? And not understanding or knowing how to manage their money appropriately.
Well, and that's the other thing that I could probably say for myself. I can only manage what I'm given, and when I hear somebody say you need to cut back on, and this is even when you listen to Dave Ramsey, for example, he'll say interesting things like, "Oh well, you millennials need to stop spending money on avocado toast and cut back on coffee." It's like, no, the problem is what we're being paid first and foremost, and in what world do you live in where you can say if you cut back on buying Starbucks or the gas station coffee that's going to budget your way to buying a house? I'm sorry, but that's a cash flow issue. I think if people were paid on a weekly basis, you would run into less problems. But you two are welcome to tell me if I'm wrong on that one.
I think that's actually sort of a great segue for me to say a little bit about working with Tiffany, because we definitely agree that income is certainly a big problem that people have. And that's why I feel blessed to be able to work with her, because one of the things that we could do is offer people, once they learn this, an opportunity to move the mission forward, an opportunity to potentially even earn income, people who maybe didn't think they wanted to be in the financial industry initially. So I think that, definitely you're right. People need to learn more so that they can also make more. But I wouldn't say that there's always this best strategy. Going back to your point about the different sort of gurus and people out there, I think each person is an individual. We need to provide them with the information and then let them decide and have, once they're informed, make the best decision about what works under their circumstances.
And that's the thing, because as much as I want to say to my friend in this situation, okay, you're wrong, I found myself saying, I think we need to figure out, how are there things that I can sell to generate an additional income, or are there opportunities out there that I can look at that will start bringing in more income instead of, oh, you can cut back on this or you can cut back on that. We're still not fixing the first major problem, as Tiffany pointed out, that you have with doctors and CEOs, which is they have money coming in probably on a weekly basis just because of the fact they can bill insurances. With that, and I think you both are able to bill insurances from a clinical therapy perspective, correct? You can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but because I was seeing a therapist for a little while, but one of the reasons she didn't want to see me anymore was because I had to pay out of pocket since she couldn't work with my insurance MVP, which is not an easy insurance for most clinical people to probably want to work with to begin with. But then we have another problem, which is why I'm on MVP in the first place, because what realistically can I afford out there, even from an insurance where I have to pay a deductible and a copay? I'm only making $20.
I think that's a really important conversation in terms of accessibility of any resources, and the fact that mental health services are pricey and costly, and not everybody can realistically afford them.
And providers don't want to work with every insurance. Then you want somebody to pay out of pocket. But then if you're going to adjust it to my income, which at $20 an hour was $60 a session, can I really in all common sense afford something like that? Like now we're looking at it as a luxury service over what it's really supposed to be, which is it's an important service that's needed for some people.
Right. It's also an investment in health.
But unfortunately, because we're in the United States of America, everything has to get treated like it's a luxury product or a luxury service that only people with higher incomes can afford. I don't know if I'm incorrect on this, because that'll be a whole separate panel discussion, for therapists, which is, there's a whole group of people who maybe not everyone wants to build a certain type of an insurance just to be able to work with. Then there's an old mental health counselor that I recontacted 2 years ago who runs his own practice. Guess how much he bills his clients? $300 a session.
Yeah, I also really feel that the intersectionality, and which is one of the reasons why I got into finance, the intersectionality of mental health and finance is really important, of our own relationship with money, our own habits and patterns that we have, or behavioral patterns that we have with money, how we spend it, how we save it, and what we think in terms of risk. All of those conversations are also directly related to mental health.
So Francis and I
What's
were
your
having
phrase, Francis?
Yeah, I was going to.
What's your phrase, Francis?
Phrase, yes, of course. I had said it, the idea, money, health is mental health, and health is wealth. Those are the two things. And real quick, Benjamin, just to your point, the current picture of America, the way I look at it is, unfortunately, what we have, and I think you would probably agree with me, is think of just the idea of Banana Republic, Gap, and Old Navy. Same parent company, each one, same products, maybe a little bit different. And I think that if you look at that, you see our healthcare system in general. Forget about mental health. So I think part of what you're saying is that maybe there are people who, when I work in private practice, same problem, out of pocket, they, bill certain insurances. In the community clinics, at least we can take Medicaid, and help people that route. And if, for example, if you are in a certain group, so you can, like, maybe if you have OPWDD because you need the services and whatever else, there's straight Medicaid and managed care Medicaid. So I think that those are the quote unquote solutions that they try to find so that people can get some form of care. It's not ideal. And obviously we're working towards being able to help people not even need to worry about that, eventually become, financially independent and savvy. But that's just what the picture currently is. And I think we can move forward from there.
That's where we need, I believe, this is where we start to need younger leaders making these decisions. And that would be a whole conversation you start, with not just at the grassroots movement, but it's going to have to start saying, look, if you're a baby boomer and you want to continue to be in elected office, you have to start listening to younger constituents within your state and within your district, because otherwise we're not going to keep voting for you. Like, for example, this is one of the reasons Bernie Sanders had become so popular with our age group, is for somebody who's the same age as the president of the United States, this is where they're polar opposites. Bernie understands what the youth wants. Biden, for whatever reason, he sort of does, but he doesn't. I feel like Biden doesn't make much of an effort with the younger people, whereas Bernie does, because that's who, even propelled him to where he is today. So now that we've gotten a little bit to know about the both of you, here are a couple questions for you, because I'm sure you both, want to take a few minutes to discuss this one. Okay, for autistic men and women like myself, what are ways that you guys could suggest that we could still participate in things like the stock market, or be able to eventually purchase our own home? What are some tips that you could share with workers like myself, in this category, or even parents to get their kids learning about money?
Go for it,
Well,
Francis.
I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that we shouldn't act like society and think that, you need like some additional special kind of support in that area necessarily. Yes, the idea of information and learning about it. But I think once you have the information, you have just as much capacity and ability to sort of invest, in these things. I think that it's just providing the information in a way, like you were saying earlier about math, and how one engineering math you didn't get, and regular other methods of math you were able to kind of digest. It's learning about investments in a way that you can understand, and I think that's what everybody needs. And I think that people on the spectrum, who kind of like yourself, can then move on. And then in the other cases, people who are not in the same part of the spectrum, it's getting the information to people's parents so that they can then be the ones to do the same thing. But investing is investing. In many ways, you're taking the same risks. It requires the same information.
It requires ability to do research as well, which is probably a good skill that a young autistic person can learn. I mean, I could give a couple ideas myself of, channels that I've watched. I've watched Erica Kohlberg and Graham Stephan for personal finance. And frankly, when I knock them up against Sue Zorman or Dave Ramsey, I think they do a much better job with explaining this, not just because of the YouTube followings, but because they're younger and more relatable. I can't relate to somebody like a Dave Ramsey. Not to say that he doesn't, provide valued advice, but one thing I want to say on him is you shouldn't be flogging people on your nationally broadcasted show who are calling in and basically making them feel like idiots for what they're doing financially.
I think I can also respond to the fact that realistically, not everybody is for everyone, right? There's a bunch of gurus and professionals of all different fields. And a lot of it is about either finding what's right for you and applying it, right? It's weeding out what doesn't resonate. And I think a huge component of why I do what I do is to be that person that looks like the community that I'm looking to serve, that looks like the population that I'm looking to serve, that also relates in a very wholesome way of looking at the whole of a person, not just what are their numbers. Yes, numbers are fact and fact is absolute, but the realistic aspect is that education, when it's applied, that's where the capacity and the power comes in. And I believe that what Francis and I are really working to do on a one-on-one basis is just teaching, each one teach one, helping one family at a time develop their own capacity, develop their own agency to reach their goals, regardless of different ability or regardless of socioeconomic background or identity, intersectionality, right? Like it does not matter. We are able to sit with any person of any spectrum of their economics and able to help and provide value. I think that's what really differentiates us from the industry, where the industry largely, the financial industry largely just speaks to higher earners, folks who have 150,000, 250,000
Yeah, that
dollars
would be the
after
community
all.
that you would be talking about the community that I grew up in, which is mostly, I'll say it in the nicest possible way, basically rich white people.
Right. And not only that, I think it's abled people as well, right? Like folks who may be really well versed, have a professional background or have multiple businesses. What about
It's
middle
as
America?
my mother once pointed out to me, even as well. I mean, I can say that she's not wrong because if you lived, the idea is if you lived in a wealthier area, you were clearly better educated. But she acknowledged over the last few years that even a lot of her own generation have gotten severely greedy and made it impossible for this age group, anyone in their 30s, to be able to do much of anything now, even with, more realistic raises. She's acknowledged it. But, when you come from an area like I did, where mostly everybody's parents were either doctors, engineers, lawyers, they were able to provide for their kids. Whereas I was the child of a single parent. My dad, is still in my life helping me to this day. But if you look at my career trajectory, especially being on the spectrum, if I'm only making $20 an hour right now and my parents are consistently having to fill in, then can we really say that I've gotten into a better place in my life? And my answer would be no. I might, on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, looking at the first two levels, have what I need. But, if I'm constantly stressed and people assume I'm complaining, it's because they haven't been unemployed. They didn't get they, they didn't get they didn't get let go from their job in the middle of COVID when we first experienced that. They didn't have to wait 4 months just to get approved for federal pandemic benefits. So how can they understand what what my needs are and then sit there and say, well, your life is improved? I mean, you're making more money than you once did. It's not a good comparison. That's something even Francis just said before you came on. Is it realistic when talking about kids on the autistic spectrum or even low income communities to compare them to high income communities? I think it's terrible to do that. I think everyone should stop comparing a higher function autistic to a lower function autistic, because here's something really interesting. The lower functioning autistic actually gets more help from the government than the higher function autistic. The higher function autistic, in my case, has basically been told, yeah, you don't qualify. So you can't compare. That's my 2 cents on that. All right.
Let's divide and conquer. I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, like I was saying, I think it's divide and conquer, Benjamin. I think it's kind of speaking to what you were saying about people have gotten greedy. I think it's just that historically, not just the 1980s where greed was good, but even going back to the origins of this country, it was about going out and building wealth. And even historically in other countries, colonialism, what was that all about? Kind of making money and sort of growing, and it's folded into like our culture. Now that in itself, the growing wealth, I don't think is a bad thing. I think that the piece that's missing, and I think what Tiffany and I are trying to sort of add to that, is the good that can be done with that wealth, how we can lift each other up. And that's the piece that's missing, realizing that we're more similar than different. And that once we get into that place, that place of power and wealth, with great power and wealth comes great responsibility to help others, not to push them down when they try to get
somebody
up.
loved Batman as a child, because I remember that is the standout line of that whole cartoon. And that's what a lot of rich people, I think, don't realize nowadays. Mm-hmm. Or they know it and then they just conveniently forget about it.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to look at Jeff Bezos, for example, look at all that money that he possesses, but what good has he really done for society with other than providing jobs. So I'm going to ask you one last question within the therapy field, because I have a feeling some people are probably going to view this who are trying to get into the field. What does a psychotherapist do? And I'm sure both of you know this.
Yes, definitely. I mean, we do many things, first of all, because what we do has to do with where the client is at, meeting them where they're at. So they'll come to us for different reasons. So, but essentially what we do is help people identify what their need is. And then once they've identified, help them come up with different strategies and way to address those needs. And I'm putting it in the most generic way, because at the end of the day, those are the social work skills that we can apply anywhere and that help people that, people would benefit from learning. The idea of having the reflection to identify a need, identify the goals, then identify a route to get there, like, different strategies. And then, of course, the hardest part, implement it. Because I think that we all, for sure, we have all these to help, self-help books. We have all these answers. It's kind of like dieting. We all know what we need to do to lose weight, and we still don't. Why? Because I'm the first to admit it. We don't apply it. So we help people apply the things by providing them, with support, with the recognition, with the validation, with the encouragement, as well as helping them identify some strategies if they can't find them on their own. That's what a therapist does.
All right, Tiffany, how would you answer that question? I think you're a psychotherapist yourself, correct?
Yeah, I do wear many hats. And as my aside, I am a psychotherapist, and very similar to or very exactly what Francis just said, is being able to meet a person where they are at, identify what it is they seek, or what their ultimate goal is, and being able to help support them in their own journey, whatever that looks like. It might be, a lot of people might want to dive deep into their past. A lot of people might want to plan for their future. And a lot of people might want to just be figuring it out of how to make it day by day. And so we're there to be able to support their journey at any step of their life.
Okay. And you might be willing to answer this, but grant writer, because there were 5 jobs that I didn't realize social workers could do, because I had one social worker on here who didn't even go the clinical path, who ended up becoming a nonprofit board member and lobbyist. But lobbyist and grant writer, as well as public policy analyst, were positions that I would like to be able to obtain. But what do you need to become an effective grant writer?
Yeah, for grant writing, I have been a grant writer for about maybe 10 years since post grad. And I had done a lot of grant writing through my internship. What you need to be an effective grant writer is to know how to tell a compelling story, is to know how to share what your company's mission is, what your goals are, how you actually plan to get there, and to know your past as an organization, and or in order to be able to plan for your future accordingly. What is it that you're asking for? Being really specific in your numbers. Why are you asking for it? And knowing who your funder is. Your relationship to your funder, or the relationship to the organization, needs to also be directly in alignment with their values, what they are looking to fund, and being able to speak to that message.
Interesting, because I feel like now that I've been doing this for a while, I could probably translate over to a grant writer since I can tell stories. And that's exactly what a chunk of my podcasts are, which is basically me becoming a storyteller versus, just trying to compete with everybody else for the same thing. And then, let's see, do I want to ask you guys one more question? Yeah, all right. Since you are a clinical services supervisor, would you mind both telling me what you see that clinical services supervisors do differently in mental health that they would in health versus healthcare?
Well, I can speak to that, having worked at a hospital and dealt with that there, as well as now been at the community clinic that I do supervision at. I think it's not so much something that's done differently. I think it's a skill that you use the same. I think it's more the content. So, for example, obviously in a hospital, some of the issues that you're dealing with are more medical concerns and helping families through challenging times, whether it's economic stemming from a loved one having a chronic condition. So it's a lot of helping clinicians kind of learn or work on their empathy, how to communicate with those families, potentially resources that are available, and looking at that work. And in the therapy piece, a lot of those clients, it's more sort of the mental health. So, the anxiety, the idea of depression. So in some ways, less tangible things to people where the root cause isn't always apparent. So it's about helping the clinicians gain the confidence, one, and in both cases, I think this is true, realize that they know more than they do, but helping them realize it for themselves by, having them answer the right questions, like how to proceed, what are you asking the families, and then helping them use that to lead them in the direction that they need to go.
Okay. Yeah. So, and the other thing, does that position work under someone in the medical field? The clinical services supervisor usually would report to the patient care manager, who just so happens to be a nurse.
In the hospital setting, correct. And then in my case, it's more, I'm part of the I'd be considered part of the administration at the clinic in that way. So, I actually go directly to Madeline, who's one of our co-founders, as well as Mary. Those are, the folks but I wouldn't call it reporting to in that way. I think that
well, no, because in a hospital or a medical
right.
group, there's a whole hierarchy.
Right.
In a startup clinic, it's obviously you go directly to the two founders for any actual issues. And it's funny.
Right.
I think this is one, I'm going to end on this. And this is what I believe everybody mistakes when they say nobody wants to work anymore. This is what when you say that statement, here's what I think we should really be saying. Is it nobody wants to work anymore? Or is it nobody wants to go through 10 layers just to speak to someone about a direct problem that they have with their role or they have with their salary, like a standard human resource department? No, that's what we're tired of. We're tired of the complex layers in an organization, for something like that. And I'm going to end on this. I've effectively just defined to an extent or mentioned, this is what quiet quitting started as, which is basically just saying, I'm getting tired of this. I need a change in my life. Thank you both for stopping by today. All right.
Thank you.
We'll all speak soon. All right. Have a good Sunday to both of you.
You too. Thanks. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
No, I don't.